Hello, thanks for joining us. Tonight, the undercover police operation to smash Asian gangs, and later the bloody battle for control of South Africa's townships.
This is a massacre. Tonight we don't know where we're going to sleep.
We are tired. Yes. No shooting. Please.
It is a conflict that revolves around personalities, and only those personalities can in fact help resolve it.
If the government is taking advantage of our desire for peace, they are going to have war in this country.
For some time now, police have been fighting to crack organised Vietnamese gangs taking hold in predominantly Asian suburbs of Sydney and Melbourne. The National Crime Authority is convinced the gangs are major distributors of heroin in this country, involved also in extortion and standover tactics. But the NCA undercover operation, known as Operation Iliad, has made a breakthrough, as Martin King reports.
This is the face of Vietnamese violence. His name is Bo Nam, and his victims are his countrymen.
I shoot you, I shoot you. If you ask me the money, I will shoot you.
Bo Nam is a gang leader and standover man. For years he's run protection rackets and extorted money from shopkeepers and restaurateurs.
The two men come to my shop one day, asked me to buy them $100 a month. So I said no to them. 2 days later, my shop window broken.
And business owners had every reason to fear Bo Nam, as this police surveillance film shows. This is Bo Nam and his gang involved in a vicious brawl with a rival Turkish gang outside a Vietnamese shop. And that's Bo Nam wielding the meat cleaver. The man on the receiving end lost his left ear.
Where are you going? We met before?
Oh yeah. What's your name?
Huh?
Tang. Tang. You got some ID on your tang? No.
Sergeant Henry Van Andel and Constable Joel Quizon are members of the Victoria Police Ethnic Squad. They call themselves Ethnic Cops.
Vietnamese dragon.
Vietnamese dragon. Where'd you get it done? Vietnam or here?
For these young unattached males, tattoos are a trademark. For the police, they're more like a brand.
Well, it's a problem that we view seriously. I mean, it's our job to get out there and amongst them to identify the people in these groups.
Detective Sergeant Steve Pearce is the officer in charge of the Victoria Police Asian Division, which works closely with the ethnic cops.
I think the important thing to consider with the Indo-Chinese population in Victoria is that 99% of their community are hard-working and law-abiding. It's particularly this very small criminal element which gives them a bad name.
The first incident happened about 9:20 when a fierce argument developed among a group of Asian men in Victoria Street, Abbotsford. A man was stabbed a number of times and a car was shot up.
A rifle, knife and other weapons were produced. An iron bar was used to smash the windows of the Commodore.
Why do these people always seem to carry weapons?
It's something about the criminal element of the Indo-Chinese that they have a propensity to carry particularly knives and machetes and those type of... It's apparently because of their stature. They feel that the weapon helps them grow in stature.
The Vietnamese gangs were involved in extortion, drugs and gambling. But the biggest problem faced by police is that few of the victims want to come forward, and there's a very good reason for that.
They're very scared because they think that if the information that's passed on to the police is let out to the crooks, that they're going to be history.
And the business owners' fears are understandable. In several cases they have come forward, only to be revisited by the gang, and the message is crystal clear.
Breaking shop windows, actual physical harm to them, scaring away customers from their shops.
And there's this. Gambling in Melbourne's Chinatown has always been a problem for police. But it was only after raids like this that they discovered the Vietnamese gangs were trying to muscle in on the operation.
Now you show me if you hit the money.
But it didn't stop there.
There was a recent upsurge in the Melbourne Chinatown area involved with both guns and weapons. There was a particularly nasty incident recently where a firearm was discharged inside a restaurant, and a gun was held to the head of a manager.
The gang's tactics were simple. A big group of them would invade a restaurant or a nightclub, and each member of the gang would occupy a table so no other customers could sit down. They'd order enormous amounts of food and drink and leave without paying for them. Then came the sting.
This will continue for some time, and then the leaders of the gang will come along and say, well, we'll stop this for you, we'll give you protection, and you pay us $300 to $400 or more a week.
Many of the restaurant owners agreed to pay. Then recently, police smashed the racket and arrested 5 Vietnamese men.
Take your shoes off. We told your mate not to come back here.
Now, a major police concern is the Vietnamese involvement in heroin. Vietnamese criminals set up a major heroin distribution centre, but after a police surveillance operation, which included footage like this, 16 people were charged with trafficking.
At the time, it was one of the major areas, yes, the major supply areas to the rest of Melbourne. Various criminals were identified from all parts of Melbourne coming there to purchase heroin.
Remember Bo Nam, the standover man with the meat cleaver? This is his home turf, the Melbourne suburb of Springvale. Bo Nam ruled the Vietnamese community here like Al Capone ruled Chicago in the 20s, and his tactics were just as brazen.
Well, this individual with a number of his gang members went into a pool room. They locked the doors behind them. They made everyone stand against the wall. They terrorised and threatened them all. Then they basically kidnapped at least 10 of the people and took them back to a house in the local area where they made further demands upon them for money.
The next day, Bo Nam collected $2,000 from his victims, but 9 of them complained to police. Bo Nam got 7.5 years jail.
That's the way. Hello. Hello. What's your name? Chum. Chum. How are you?
The Victoria Police, through the Asian Division and the ethnic cops, have mounted a long-term campaign to win the confidence of the Vietnamese community.
We're part of what's called a police ethnic unit, and what we do...
These people have come from places where the police are seen as part of the military or political in some way. We don't walk around with machine guns, and we're not the heavy-handed type of police force that they're perhaps used to.
Ouch! That hurt. No, he took you there.
We go out there and talk to the owners of the shops and the restaurants and try and get the information from them, and then we pass it on to the other agencies.
The campaign is already working. Police now receive many calls from Vietnamese traders who've been targeted by extortionists. Winning over the traders is one thing, but changing the likes of Bo Nam is another.
They'll knife you as quick as look at you.
Martin King reporting. We'll be back with more in a moment. Well, for the Labor Party, yesterday's privatisation decision really was the sale of the century. The government hopes to raise up to $5 billion from the sale of Qantas and Australian Airlines and the introduction of a competitor to telecom. The Prime Minister has promised that the historic decision will save us all money. Cheaper phone calls, cheaper airfares and better service all around from increased competition. The opposition is far from impressed. Today they're accusing the government of caving in to union pressure and shying away from the real challenge of full privatisation of both airlines and the country's telecommunications. Joining us now, Communications Minister Kim Beazley and Deputy Opposition Leader Peter Reith. Gentlemen, thank you both for your time this evening. Mr. Beazley, a quiz question for you. Who said these words? As anyone who thinks about the issue of privatisation knows, it would mean higher prices, higher costs, higher taxes and higher fares.
Well, I'm not particularly interested in those particular words.
Mr. Beazley, the words are rather important because they're the words of your leader just 5 years ago.
Well, and my leader has made a statement in Parliament which he's clearly said that he's walked back from those particular propositions. And as he did several years ago when he called for the privatisation of the airline.
Mr. Beazley, why then was a fallacy central to your party's beliefs for all this time?
Well, it wasn't a fallacy central to our party beliefs for all this time. When Ben Chifley created Australian and Qantas in public ownership, he created them because there was no other means of assuring that there would be aviation services around our country. Now that situation has receded.
Mr. Reith, you've called the government's reform in this area a dog's breakfast. How so?
Well, because, look, they're selling half one airline, they're not selling telecom, and they're selling 100% of another. And the fact is, as Mr. Beasley just said, when you move to full deregulation, you really ought to get the government out of there and sell the enterprise. That's what they're doing in airlines. The fact is, Kim, that you as usual, you went along with the unions, you did what they wanted to make sure that their position was protected, and the national interest, is put second. And the sad thing is that the economy is moving into a recession, which has been deliberately engineered by Mr. Keating. We need some really decisive action. And, after 6 months ago, you're telling us you were totally opposed to privatisation, you wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot barge pole. Here you are moving, and you're making all sorts of guarantees as usual. It's sort of, no child will live in poverty stuff. I don't think people will believe you, and you ought to be up front. You ought to go for what half your cabinet wanted, which was full competition and a decent deal for the customer, who in the end is going to pay continuing high prices and get a poor service from the new Monstercom.
Now, Mr. Reith knows nothing about communications, and in what he has said there, he demonstrates that he knows nothing about communications, nor does he know anything about his own communications policy, which was not to make the OTC the basis of a competitor. It certainly was to flog off OTC, but what they were going to do with OTC was a matter that they left opaque. What they said they were going to do was to introduce totally open contestability into the market, which means that only those areas of the business community which currently are the beneficiaries of private networks were going to be the focus of competition. There'd be no development, effectively, of an internal Australian telecommunications industry. There is no country on earth, except New Zealand, that has decided on the model adopted by the Liberal Party. No country on earth. And I go to the point of his Monstercom, or what he calls his Monstercom.
Oh, that's what Paul Keating calls it, not me. That's your mate Keating's
That is what
word.
You have called it.
That's what Mr. Keating called it.
In repeated press releases.
Yeah.
Well, let me just tell you, I've said this to the Liberal Party before. They've got to form a one-man nomenclature committee and get round the world. Because every single country, bar one and ourselves, currently has their main carrier operating both domestic and international telecommunications operations. And it is common sense for them to do that, because unless you do now, you cannot operate the sort of reliability of service, or offer the sorts of reliability of service which makes international business, for example, want to locate itself in your country. I mean, it is typical of the mindless lack of understanding that the Liberal Party has in the communications area, that they come out with this whole plethora of slogans, this plethora of attitudes, and think that they constitute a policy. My opponent, Mr. Brown, who no longer apparently appears in these debates, my opponent, Mr. Brown, had his telecommunications policy bar the privatisation of telecom 2 days after he came into office. What sort of thought process went into that?
Kim, the fact is that it might have been a big step for the Labor Party, but it was a very small step for the rest of us. And if you want me to take a world trip, the first place I'd go to Moscow, because yesterday they decided that within 500 days they were going to adopt fully free competition, free markets as a way of running the economy. And back at home, what do we find you guys doing? You're running a government-regulated duopoly, and just to add insult to injury, you're going to put one of your union mates on the umpire to control the whole thing, as if they haven't got enough influence in this decision as it is. And my guess is that in 12 or 18 months' time, as this economy continues to deteriorate, you will, if you've got an ounce of decent economic management in you, start to regret the decisions that you took yesterday.
Well, congratulations for Moscow to taking up the social democracy that we have urged, of course, on Moscow for years, and is the principal point of difference between the Labor Party and the communist socialist parties in Eastern Europe. Those outfits in Eastern Europe are gradually coming round to the sorts of common sense approach that we've had to managing the economy for years.
Now
let me just pick up a couple of...
Why don't you read the papers? This idea of government regulation is old hat.
Let's give Mr. Beasley a go.
Peter Reith is great at an endless stream of slogans, epithets and all the rest of it, none of which are true.
Mr. Beasley, if 5 years ago your leader said privatisation would be an expensive and disastrous experiment, why should we have faith that you are right today and that you were wrong 5 years ago?
Well, it certainly would be in the case of telecom. I think it would be absolutely, totally disastrous.
What about in the case of Australian Airlines?
That road. the situation with Australian Airlines has changed. I might say too that when I was aviation minister, I think now some 7 years ago, I provided the last capital injection into Australian Airlines that any government made, and likewise indeed with Qantas at that time, and that was the view that we had at the time, that those airlines could continue to prosper with that capital injection. And now much more is required, and it is not justified.
Mr. Reith, finally.
Well, and in 3 years' time, the arguments you've just used for airlines will be exactly the same arguments that we use for telecommunications. And let me say, in respect of your competitor in telecommunications, you've swallowed up the efficient OTC, you've left the debt-ridden OSAT to be the competitor, and what a competitor it will be. It will enter the ring with both hands tied behind its back. It is not the free and open competition that really would drive prices down and give the customer a better deal.
Gentlemen, we will have to leave it there. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks.
Okay.
They really do get on well, don't they? Communications Minister Kim Beazley and Deputy Opposition Leader Peter Reith. Coming up, a new wave of violence sweeps South Africa. As you may have seen in the news, South African President F.W. de Klerk visited his American counterpart in Washington today. His meeting with President George Bush was seen as a reward for South Africa's move to abolish apartheid. But this promise of political change has not tempered the violence that still sweeps the country. We've just received this satellite report from American newsman Don Cladstrup, and a warning that some of you, especially young viewers, may find several scenes disturbing.
Another day in Katlehong. Another death. Another gruesome killing. Another chilling reminder of what it's like these days to live in a black township. The violence that erupted 7 weeks ago was the bloodiest ever. Nearly 800 people killed. Homes, entire neighborhoods destroyed. But how does one measure the suffering? What statistic can fully explain the horror of being burnt alive, of waking up and discovering the nightmare is real?
Look what happened. This is a massacre. Tonight we don't know where we're going to sleep.
A week and a half ago, another massacre. This one by armed gangs who killed 26 helpless passengers on a commuter train and wounded more than 100.
And as we pray now,
At a memorial service for the victims, there were prayers and questions. Who are the villains? Why did it happen? Was it just faction fighting, more black-on-black violence? Or is something else involved? Something more sinister?
There is some hidden hand here.
Coordinated, some think, by ultra-conservative whites, agent provocateurs with blackened faces, trying to sabotage President de Klerk's peace initiatives by making the country ungovernable, and ripe for a military coup.
One shouldn't forget that large sectors of the white population regard President de Klerk as the enemy, and probably, if you're looking at a percentage, even more of the police, of the white police.
De Klerk himself was reminded of that when a speech to party faithful last month went up in a cloud of smoke. Tear gas. Who fired it remains a mystery. What many fear is that the same could happen to the country's peace process.
We still remain committed to that idea. But if the government is taking advantage of our desire for peace, they are going to have war in this country.
Mandela has charged that the government's new security measures are aimed at dividing blacks and creating a climate of fear in the townships. Authorities vow iron fist, as the measures are called, will be applied firmly and impartially.
So I want the people, please, to just go home. All right, put down their arms and go home. No more trouble.
But don't bet on it. To many here, it's the police who provoke much of the violence, who often shoot first, and maybe ask questions later.
We are tired. Yes. No shooting. Please. They are killing our brothers, sisters, and our fathers. What must we do?
If the police are seen as biased, if the police are seen as unfair in their policing, what that will do is that people will take the law into their own hands.
Much of the lawlessness has swirled around migrant hostels, where tribal and ethnic rivalries are fueled by competition for jobs. On one side, the Xhosas, Nelson Mandela's tribe.
We are the Xhosas. We can fight. We can fight for our rights.
Their enemy, the Zulus, led by Inkatha leader Mangosuthu Buthelezi. But news that Mandela and Buthelezi will soon hold their first direct talks raises hope such hatreds might end.
It is a conflict that revolves around personalities, and only those personalities can in fact help resolve it.
Those personalities, and a third. The one Soweto school children recently welcomed, with something more meaningful than a red carpet, their hearts.
Welcome, welcome, welcome.
It is ironic, perhaps, that this man has become a symbol of hope for much of the black community.
I love Mr. Clark because Mr. Clark is our president.
But after a year in office, de Klerk knows, as others do, that the forces of change he's unleashed could spin out of control.
And then it will become bad, you know, because then the chaos will just become even worse than it is right now.
The new South Africa will...
it'll just disappear.
Despite the obstacles, nearly everyone believes change is inevitable. No one, however, expects the new South Africa to spring up overnight. Apartheid is dead, said one observer, but its burial may still take some time.
New South Africa, that report from Don Kladstrup of the American Broadcasting Company. Back in a moment. Tomorrow night, a public school with a difference, where the pupils can't wait to start their lessons. Here they learn not just the 3 R's, but how to be future stars.
This is Newtown School of the Performing Arts. Dance, music and drama are all on the curriculum here.
It's a lot better than just being in a normal school. You can perform. When I'm older, I want to become a jazz player. I want to entertain and stuff like that.
Tracy Bowden with that story tomorrow. I hope you can join us then. And that is our program for tonight. Thank you for being with us. Good night.